For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means.
Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel.
Tonight's featured show is Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Kelby. And tonight we have Jim White and Cliff Gardner. They're going to be back for a repeat performance. We'll be talking about something we were talking about almost 2 years ago on this very network. And at that time, we were talking about how the West is being assaulted. There's a wholesale attempt to take ranching and farming and animal husbandry off the land and turn the western United States back into, what they call pre-Columbian wilderness, but rewilding of the West. And this has been a program that's been conducted by radical environmental groups, people like Earth First, now some of the more mainstream groups, if you could call them that, like Defenders of Wildlife and the Natural Resource Defense Council, and some of these other groups are throwing literally billions of dollars into the process of rewilding the western United States and eliminating private land ownership and agriculture in the West. And the ranching communities have been hit hardest of all because the ranching communities represent the most independent thinkers of all the Western settlers. And frankly, they don't fit the New World Order. So with that, Jim, I'd like to introduce you first and have you tell our listeners a little bit about your background and about Northwest Liberty News and some of the projects that you're working on there. We won't get into your new film project until we get a little further into the discussion, but tell our listeners a little bit more about you and the projects you're working on.
Well, first of all, Dan, thanks so much for having me on the program. I really appreciate it. I'd be happy to do so. A couple of years back, I actually just crossed over the 5-year anniversary of starting Northwest Liberty News. I felt there was a need to wake people up, and in a sense, and try to put truth out as much as I could, because we're living in a world of fake news, as we've found out some years going forward. So I actually just started. I picked up a camera, and I was fortunate enough to be able to buy a really nice equipment up front, which I'm so thankful that I did, because it really helped. Certainly helped the quality of the videos that I had produced. And I just started going to events and recording. This area that I live in here in the Flathead Valley, as you know, Dan, is at one point it was sort of the hub, or one of the hubs of, I guess you'd want to call it the Liberty Movement, Freedom Movement, whatever you want to call it. And there was a lot of events around here, and a lot of people came through. Not as much as it used to be, but back then when they did, I was there with my camera usually, recording the event, and of course I just utilized the free media available, YouTube and other platforms, which of course are taken away from conservatives now on a regular basis. So I just I started doing videos, and I got approached by the Oath Keepers and asked if I would go down to. It was right around the same time that the event was happening down at the Bundy Ranch. I was asked to go down there with Jason. Actually, I picked up Jason the first time I'd ever met Jason, who you know, Dan, Jason Van Tatenhove, who I went on to subsequently broadcast with, I think, for over a year on the Liberty Brothers. and he went on the Oath Keepers and became the national. I think, media consultant or media person for the Oath Keepers. At any rate, we went down to the Bundy Ranch and spent a lot of time down there, and really were right in, involved in the action. We're just involved doing camera stuff. Jason was doing the radio, responding on the radio, and I was making the videos, and it just picked up from there. And I actually became friends with Michelle. I can't remember her name now. Cliff, you know her, Michelle Fiore, down in Las Vegas, who was a really liberty-minded. She's like a council person down there. So I called her and asked her. I said, I really want to do something with. I really want to do something with. I don't want this to go away. The rancher situation down at the Bundy Ranch. What can I do? I feel like I need to be able to get this going. So she hooked me up with Cliff, and we can certainly go into that as we get into the documentary. But we traveled across Nevada together, Cliff and I, visiting ranchers. But that's probably enough for now. We can go into that later.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, that's a good lead in. And incidentally, Jim, I think you and I met probably when you were toward the beginning of your filming career. You came to one of my events and filmed my Sustainable Destruction Exposing UN Agenda 21 in Rural America. And as of a few days ago, we had almost 70,000 views on that. So you obviously did a good job. So
well, thanks, Dan. It's funny you mentioned that because I told my wife we still get about 400. I still get about 400 or 500 views, I believe, every week on that video. If you can believe that, and it's been like 4 years. It's like 4 years old, and that's just a testament, I think, of the information, Dan, not the video quality. I think the information in there was just stellar.
Well, it is, and the truth is the truth, and the fact is if we bring it before the American people, we expect them to do something with it, and it appears that they are starting to do that, and I'm really pleased with that. So, Cliff, you were on this program, and it's been almost 2 years ago when you were on the last time, but you were telling us about a project that you had called Rural Heritage Preservation Project. You were basically putting together documentation on all of the different acts and laws and programs and things that have happened in the West. And I want you to tell our listeners a little about your background and then maybe a little about that project.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I've been around quite a while. I'm a fourth-generation rancher living in northeastern Nevada. And typical of nearly all ranchers in our state, in our region, we were dependent, our ranching operation was dependent on the Forest Service, on the Bureau of Land Management, as well as on one of the refuges that was created here in the West in the 1930s, the Ruby Lake National Wildlife Refuge. So early on, as a young man, I took the responsibility of the cattle and dealing with persons that were managing and involved in managing these various agencies. And so I think probably dating back to the 1960s is when I first started seeing attitudes change in these people, particularly the younger people that were being graduated from college back at that time, and their attitude that all man-affected activities was bad, and the fact that they thought they were going to have to remove livestock from the refuge lands. And what I was seeing and hearing did not correlate with what I had seen and experienced on the ground. So it was even back at that time I began challenging these people and asking them for copies of the studies, the science that supported what they were advocating. And later, dating up until the end of the 1980s, when the Forest Service became more aggressive, and they too wanting to remove all livestock from the public lands. Then other people that I was communicating with across the West who became lifelong friends, some of those being Wayne Hage and then later the Bundys and other families that were adversely affected and were greatly involved in our side of the fight. They realized and respected some of the work I was putting together with my research, and they encouraged me more. And so today I probably have possibly the largest library regarding Western public land settlement, all of the legal court cases and conflicts that have come down over the years, as well as the scientific studies, thousands, hundreds anyway, of scientific studies dealing with everything that has to do with public lands management, public lands use by mining, ranching, recreation, etc. And so that has been my contribution. And you mentioned Rural Heritage Preservation Project. That was the product of those efforts, was to try to categorize that and make it available to the public and help those like yourself and Jim that are trying to stand up for America and our original values and support you with whatever science or facts or historical evidence that I might have in such a way so that you and others could be successful.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've provided a valuable resource, and I know at the last conversation we had, one of the things that we want to make sure is that those resources are scattered around, and by scattered around I mean enough copies of everything that you've been able to research, that no matter what happens, if we have an inconvenient fire, we know how the government is, and quite frankly, you know, your information is not, let's say, productive for the government position. Your research has done the exact opposite of proving that ranchers are not good for the land. Your research, and I think most legitimate research, shows that ranchers are great conservationists and that grazing on public lands actually improves the grazing for wildlife and everything else. It improves that resource. And so whatever you do, make sure you've got enough copies of everything that you've got that it can't be destroyed with one very convenient fire or something like that. So, Jim, you mentioned starting the conversation before we actually went on the air that you saw something in the Wall Street Journal today about the Hage family ranch. Can you tell our listeners what you ran into?
Yeah, sure, I can. The story actually, it just popped up on Twitter today, but it looks like the story is from March 30th, so it's only a couple of days old, and it's about the actual title of it on the Wall Street Journal, if anybody wants to look it up. The actual title is "In the Battle for the American West, the Cowboys are Losing," and the subheading is "Federal lands west of the Rockies are now also home to more hikers and campers, and the competition is fierce." Now, I submit to you that it's not the hikers and the campers. I submit to you, and Cliff can certainly, and Dan, you know this as well. You've seen the maps.
Sure.
From what I understand, there's about $53 trillion with a T, $53 trillion worth of resources out west. So I submit to you, it's not the backpackers and the hikers. It's the people that want to get their hands on that loot. Any thoughts on that, Cliff?
Yes, I see things just a little bit different in that my concept or perception is that that the culture of America has changed since the early founding, and we have so many working within agencies today that philosophies among those that are employed by these various agencies want to bring everything back to a natural state. My biggest conflict with them in particular is that, and my research has led me into the time when the western lands were first being settled, when homesteaders were coming out and taking up water and lands, miners were making claims on minerals. All my research shows that there were almost no wildlife of any great extent, particularly in the Great Basin. There were no wolves, particularly because there was no game to support wolves. There were no mountain lions in the Great Basin because there wasn't anything to sustain them. So after settlers came, in order to protect their crops and their their livestock and their poultry and so forth, they began practicing predator control in one manner or another. And of course, just a little later, then a lot of big sheep outfits came into being, and they conducted effective predator control. And that's when a balance was created between predators and prey animals began to explode in number. We had mule deer. If you read any history in the 1940s and 50s, almost in all the western states, there was an explosion of mule deer in particular, and sage-grouse. And that was all of the product of the sheep industry, livestock industry, and predator control. But these people that work within the agencies and the people that support them, being the conservation organizations, they do not want that to be well understood, because their livelihoods all depend upon the American public in general believing otherwise. So that's where my battle's at, in getting that information out. And it's very difficult to do because the general population today always it's just part of nature that people want to believe that everything was optimum in the pristine state, which was not true. Sage-grouse in particularly were a product. In fact, during the first 20 years of all the exploration in the western United States, Jedediah Smith, Peter Skeen Ogden, John Work, the earliest families that come across in the caravans to California. First 20 years, there were no sage-grouse seen. It was after the areas had been impacted by livestock being transported and moved across the Great Basin to California, and after settlement began to occur, that's when we had the explosion of sage-grouse. And so that's some of the message that I try to get across.
And Cliff, your comments are right on the money. If you look at the highest sage-grouse populations we had, and we'll pick that one particular item, the highest sage-grouse populations we had ever were between the 1940s and the late 1960s. And when the sage-grouse population started to drop was when we signed on to the UN protection of eagles and so-called predatory birds, which include ravens and magpies and a whole bunch of nest robbers. And that's when, and the coyotes and all the other, that's when the sage-grouse numbers started to drop. But it was actually, it was the ravens, and they've done studies on this. I've seen the scientific studies they've done on this, that ravens and skunks and magpies are the primary predators of sage-grouse, not humans.
That's right. Every study I've seen shows that those declines begin in earnest declines in sage grouse begin in earnest. Soon after, President Nixon outlawed the use of toxins in 1972, and have continued. And again, all of those studies show that right now, almost uniformly, we're losing 80 to 85% of the chicks even before they hatch in egg form, ravens being the most proficient predator out there that destroys sage grouse to death. But then you lose so many after hatched as well, so that's why we're realizing the decline of sage grouse. But these agency people and their support groups do not want the public to understand this because, as an example, the agencies that I've mentioned repeatedly during our conversation this evening have almost doubled their income because of the application of the Endangered Species Act. No, they haven't listed sage grouse yet, but they don't have to. Because now with the threat of listing, the agencies are getting everything done they want to anyway. They're getting all the funding they could possibly want. And so on and on it goes.
You're exactly right. And I was on a BLM rack for some years, and we were supposed to be looking at the sage grouse problem in Montana. And I kept saying to the agency and to the other people on the rack, look, I can show you the scientific proof that human impact on sage grouse is absolutely minimal, that almost all the impact is caused by predators and by birds and rodents that are nest robbers. And the comment that came back from the BLM was, we're not tasked to look at that. We are tasked to look at what man's impact on sage grouse is. So in other words, they were just ignoring the science, and they were only going to look at the aspect they wanted to look at, which is man. So anyway, I didn't mean to get off on a tangent there.
No, that's very important.
It is, because I was right there and I saw it happen, and there were other people that were on that BLM rack that saw that happen as well. Cliff and Jim, can you talk to our listeners about all these federal policies that came in with the EPA, with the Endangered Species Act, with FLPMA, with all these different policies that came in the 1970s, and how that changed the role of these federal agencies from being protectors of public lands and treating them as a resource to be used by the citizens and turning that into an strictly environmental perspective.
Well, I know Cliff can, Cliff can speak about he's a walking encyclopedia, the guy. He's my researcher actually for this documentary we're working on, and I couldn't have picked a better one. Now, Dan, I can speak about the you hit into the nail on the head. It seems to be the radical environmentalism really is I think one of the driving forces behind that, and that is something that you're very, very familiar with. It all works hand in glove, Dan. The Agenda 2030 used to be formerly called Agenda 21. I think they changed it to Agenda 2030, and I know Debbie Baccacialupi does a lot of great work on that. She's an excellent resource. I know a friend of both of ours. But this, Dan, is really, I believe, what you're seeing now, the things that happen with the Bundys, the things that happen with the Hammonds, who I know Cliff knows all of these people very well, and thankfully the Bundy family got released. There's others that had to plead out that are still there. But what we're seeing here with this land grab is really, I think, the fruits of all the labor of the rabid environmentalists, Dan, that go way back. Used to be really brushed off as tree huggers. Well, geez, those tree huggers now are pretty much they pretty much run things. And I hate to say that, but when it comes to the environment, they run things. So I know that part, but I know Cliff is certainly much more versed in the, technically speaking, the acts and things that were put into place to harm the average landowner, I would say.
Okay. Well, Cliff, I would pass that ball then along to you, and you really understand how the changes in all these federal agencies have kind of transformed them into something totally different than what was originally intended. And those changes started to come in a big way in the early to mid-1970s. Do you want to talk about some of those different acts and things that caused that to happen?
Yes. I was a conservative as a young man and was one of the persons that voted for Richard Nixon when he ran for office. But the thing I've learned over the years was that Mr. Nixon evidently was rabid in his desire to become president and was ready to do about anything. He made a lot of promises. So once he got into office, he is responsible during his administration for many of the acts that you mentioned. The Endangered Species Act, the FLIPMA, which was an act that affected both the BLM and Forest Service, management of the lands. Really, it was that particular act that brought about the first Sagebrush Rebellion that started right here in the state of Nevada by a small group of miners. But many of those acts were passed right there in that period, the early 1970s, and most of them passed during the Nixon administration. And it was a culmination of those people that you and Jim are talking about that brought those about. They knew what they wanted to accomplish. They worked with the agencies. They worked with the conservation organization people, and they got it all done. And there hasn't been a lot added to it since then, except another enemy has been our courts. Unfortunately, many people that become lawyers and then later on are appointed court justices in our district court positions across the United States have spent their entire lives in a abstract environment, you might say, with very little on-hand experience, and they went to the same schools as many of the other people that I mentioned, and came out of those schools believing absolutely in a more socialistic approach and believing that private enterprise is detrimental to wildlife instead of beneficial. And so they played a big part as well. The judges across the nation have played a big part as well, bringing about all of this adverse action that's causing all of our wildlife numbers to decline dramatically, and a huge part of people in mining. The small miner prospector is essentially gone. They've been gone for quite a number of years. And the first ranchers in our region to go were the small family ranchers that couldn't mother up to the government, couldn't put up money, couldn't hire attorneys, and were tried their best to communicate with each other and put up a fight, but they're all gone now. In the state of Nevada, we've lost 50% of our ranching operations, roughly 50% of the cattle, and
if I can interject here for a second, Cliff, if you look at that map, Dan, you've seen it, and you've seen it, Cliff. I'm sure. It's undeniable that everything west of the Mississippi. I think you've seen the map that has the land owned by the feds in red. I mean, there's something going on out west here, because if you look out east, some of these places have under 10% or under 5% of their property is owned by the feds. And out west out here, I think in Nevada alone, Cliff, I think it's up to 93%. Cliff can verify that. But I want to say it's up to the 90s, around the 90%, pretty close, if not over, of the land in Nevada that's controlled by the feds. So Dan, I don't know, like I said before, the only thing I could think of, and I understand, sure, we talked about the environmentalists. I think they're just the hammer, basically. I think they're the hammer. They're the hammer, and I really have to go back to. I mean, doesn't the Bible say that the love of money is the root of all evil? So I think it's the $53 trillion that's under the ground out here is a huge motivation. I just don't think they want to be mean to ranchers. I think that they have a long-term plan to own all of the resources out west.
Oh, I think you're right. And something that I was going to bring into the discussion is the, first of all, Agenda 21, which was the official document, was produced in 1992 into 93, which outlined their program to rewild much of the world. And the President's Council on Sustainable Development under Bill Clinton in 94 put all these programs in play in a big way under the administrative branch of government. And that's how it got into all these various administrative agencies. And since then, it's just been on hyperdrive. And Cliff, your comments, and I've seen the studies on this, I've seen rangeland and soil studies that say that managed intense grazing is the best thing in the world for the environment, and it improves forage for all species. Stephen Rich has written a number of articles about that, and there's photographic evidence that no grazing is a whole lot worse for the environment than intensive grazing that's well managed, well timed.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, the refuge system lands across the United States today have become dead, decadent landscapes. The wildlife are leaving at every opportunity for what private lands they are left, simply because under these conditions, rodents do not do well, and in vertebrate production, insects do not do well. And so when they're not there, then the wildlife, the bird life, and the smaller predators like coyotes and bobcats do not do well. And so populations decrease on those protected areas, but they continue to do well in private areas where livestock are impacting that vegetation. That vegetation is made healthier and more productive when it's impacted periodically. And that's what all the studies are showing. So it's keeping the agencies pretty busy in suppressing that kind of information. It's only because they have access to large amounts of money and time that they're able to keep the public snowed in that regard. If we had the resources that the agency people do, we would have won this fight a long time ago. Because in truth, when you stop and think about it, the attacks that are coming from all the groups that each of us are speaking of is an attack on our system of government. Our system of government is based upon private enterprise and having those resources in the hands of individuals. That's the best kind of stewardship. If the other systems would work, why did Russia fail? Why do most socialistic nations fail? Because centralized planning or governmental planning and management simply does not work. This is the message that I try to get out, but very difficult fight.
Well, and you're absolutely right. The cornerstone of the American system of government is private property.
That's right.
And the other cornerstone of United States system of constitutional republican government is the rights of the individual over the rights of the collective, and that's exactly the opposite of what we are seeing out of all these federal agencies. They're promoting collectivism, And Cliff, we're talking about the forage value of grazing. One of the things they found with all these studies is that periodic, very intense grazing is really good because it keeps the really woody, nasty grass species down, and it promotes the growth of the really tender, nice forage-type grasses because they get grazed once in a while, and they don't turn into these woody, different species that aren't any good for grazing.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's what I have learned over my lifetime. It's not hard to understand if you think about plant life. It's dependent on three things. It needs the soil, but it also needs sunlight and water. Photosynthesis cannot occur without sunlight. Think about going out in your yard or any place where there's grasses that grow and putting an object, say a foot by a foot, on top of the ground. You go out there a few days later and the grass is starting to turn yellow. You go out there a week later and it's all dying. Well, that's what's happening on our refuge system lands. Is when they take livestock off, the more coarse grasses grow up and they become thick and heavy, and they shade out all the understory. Right. So immediately you start, within a year or two, immediately you start losing diversity. All of the forbs, all the finer stem grasses, all the dandelion, which is important to sage grouse, begin to die out. As an example, on the Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge, it was first parts of it were designated in 1936. In the 1940s and 50s, we had lots of sage grouse on that 574,000 acre reserve. Lots of sage grouse, lots of antelope. And then they started systematically removing those livestock. And immediately they started, a study was done by a gal named Carol Evans, getting her thesis for a master's degree there in the 1980s. And she was recording the fact that there was lots of dandelion, lots of yarrow, the two species the most, of the sage grouse the most dependent upon. Well, I've made several trips up there to the Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge in these last 5 or 6 years, and I think in all of my travels and all of my visits up there, I've seen 3 dandelion plants and very little yarrow. And so they actually, by their management, destroyed the plant community that sage grouse were dependent upon. And this is generally what's happening because, as I was alluding to earlier, like in the state of Nevada now, we're running 50% of the cattle we used to, and numbers of sheep have been decreased by roughly 94 to 97%. So there's many areas that are not grazed at all any longer. And it's all of those areas that the wildlife are being forced off of and scurrying around trying to find good habitat, plus the pressure, like you mentioned, of increased numbers of crows. I think in the state of Nevada, crows outnumber sage grouse now 11-1. And these ravens and crows are patrolling the areas constantly with sharp eyes. And if there's one egg out there, they get it. And if they don't get it, then a badger or a bobcat or a coyote gets it. And it's a wonder we haven't lost even more than we already have. But fortunately, we do have some of the most productive land in private land ownership. And that is the only reason that we even have a semblance of sage grouse and many other species right now, is because of that private land ownership. Otherwise, it would go completely back to as it was when the first explorers entered to the West, where they would go for days and never see any of these species. In Nevada, deer were unknown in the 1800s. They didn't explode in number until about 1930s or late 20s or early 30s.
Mm-hmm.
Sage grouse, they came about earlier than that, but they were also a product of mankind, our enterprise, the sheep industry, and predator control.
Right, right. Well,
so we just need to find a way, and I'm really pleased to get hooked up with and become acquainted with Jim, because Jim, is, in my view, is probably doing more than anyone else in getting this kind of a story out.
I agree. And that's a good lead-in, Jim, to talk about your latest project. And that is a film that you're working on right now called Land Grab, The Conspiracy to Own All of the Natural Resources in the West. Tell our listeners about that project. What inspired you to do that? Obviously, we know, but give us a little bit more flesh on that. And then talk a little bit about, I know you're doing a crowdfunding project on this to get the financial resources to get this film off the ground.
Sure, Dan, I'd be happy to. Thanks so much. Yeah, as we talked about before, I went down there. Where I stopped off is Michelle Fiore, who's a friend of mine who gave me Cliff's number. I called Cliff. We got to talking, and I really didn't understand the magnitude of the situation really until I got down there in Nevada and started going around with Cliff. I can't even tell you where we went. We went just hundreds and hundreds of miles, maybe even 1,000, crisscrossing the state, going all points around and meeting. Incredible how Cliff knows these ranchers all over the hundreds of miles away from where he lives. He knows these people very well. And we went down there and interviewed, I can't even tell you how many, certainly over 10, probably 10 to 15 ranchers and their families there. Some of the stuff I have released, a lot of it I haven't, that I still held back. And I think what we're going to do, Dan, I just actually interviewed Ryan Bundy and Ammon Bundy here. In the last couple of weeks, I've interviewed both of them for Northwest Liberty News. And I spoke to them, and they're both very, very willing to really comment on what's going on. And I'm glad that they got let out. There was a lot. There was a sort of you really didn't know what was going to happen. I have a feeling, Dan, that if Hillary would have been elected, I don't believe that the Bundy boys or Cliven would have ever seen the light of day again. They would never have seen the outside of their cell again. So I was delighted to see them get released, and they got out really at the perfect time, because I'm pulling all this information together. I've got a really good guy, Dan Gill, who Cliff knows, who went down there and spent some time with Cliff here over the last 3 or 4 weeks to help with the documentary. And Dan Gill's been doing some great work as far as editing stuff and helping me with that. So right now, of course, everybody's doing it because they believe in, they want to get the word out and they believe in the cause. But as you know, Dan, that type of stuff, it takes money for gas and for time to go down. And we really want to interview more of the ranchers. Some of them, thankfully, one of the ranchers has passed, and another one has had a terrible medical condition where they wouldn't be able to be on this documentary had I not went down there when they were able to do the interviews. So I'm very thankful that I was able to get that stuff, sort of in the can, if you will. So what I'm really doing is I'm putting a lot of this stuff together. We're going to do some new interviews. I have a lot of stuff already, backed up on my hard drive. I have all that the Bundy video stuff from 2014, and would also like to continue. There's some more ranchers that certainly I think Wayne. We actually met with Wayne Hage down when I went down the one we talked about with the Wall Street Journal article here. I met him, and he didn't at the time. I think he was in a battle with them. He didn't want to. If I remember correctly, and that's the problem, Dan. They intimidate you. They run you off your land. They'll throw you in jail. So, there's a chilling effect, and people don't want to sometimes speak out, which really bothers me. But I'm speaking out, and I know Cliff is. And here's the thing: if we don't speak out against this, Dan, our children, grandchildren, our posterity won't have any land left at all. They're going to put people into compact cities, and there'll be a little wilderness area that you're allowed to, at their discretion and their management, you'll be able to maybe stroll through a half a mile of maybe some forestry. But other than that, everything else is going to be off limits to people. So, I think that the time is now. I think with this latest, the timing is really good. I think with this latest administration, there's at least a possibility that we can get it in the right hands. And hopefully, Dan, my goal is to be able to tell the stories of all these ranchers that have been just heinously disenfranchised and run off their land. So really, that's what I'm doing it for. So I'm putting it all together, and we have a website. I just noticed that the website is so new that my web person hasn't even switched over. It's still in Latin, but it's really low. Just went up, but it's the website's landgrabdocumentary.com. If you go to the fundraising button there's a donate now, and that takes you right to the GoFundMe page. And that's just new too. We just started trying to get, this pulled together so we can continue to keep this going, and we want to get this done. The anniversary of the Bundy Ranch incident, the 5-year anniversary, which is coming up here in just about a year. We'd like to have this all done and ready to go.
Well, and I'd like to remind everybody it doesn't take, one or two people to donate $10,000 or $20,000. I mean, that's great if it happens. But the reality is if everybody gives $5 or $10 and we have enough people do that, you can generate an awful lot of money that way. And that is the kind of funding that we need, because not only does that accomplish what you need to accomplish, it also shows that there's a huge grassroots push to see this kind of information exposed. And that's as important for a producer like yourself, someone who's working on these projects, to know. I think you'd probably rather have 10,000 $5 donations than you'd like to have $10,000 donations, just because it shows a lot more grassroots support.
Oh, absolutely, I would. That's the whole thing. That's the reason that, all of us here, everybody on this network, this RNN network, Dan, yourself, myself, Cliff, people don't understand. There's not really a whole lot of money in this, as far as not. You don't go into this for the money if that's what you're doing it for, because you're going to be sadly disappointed. You have to have a heart for it. And I have a heart. Especially since I had a chance to look at these ranchers, look them in their eye, and just realize that these are salt of the earth people here. All they wanted to do was just ranch. They just wanted to ranch and be left alone. That's all they wanted. They just wanted to ranch and be left alone, spend their family. Some of them are 3rd and 4th generation ranchers. I think the Bundys have had their ranch for 140 years, I think, if I remember correctly. So, they just want to do their thing. And, this is the backbone. Really, the ranchers, they're the people that really feed us. They're the people that that provide. And it almost reminds me of the vets, Dan, how they come back. And after they've done so much for this collectively, done so much for this country, they're treated so poorly. And I think, that really bothers me. And that's why I think we have to get the word out.
Something, Dan, I'd like to mention is that I think everybody that is sympathetic to our cause needs to understand that it doesn't take very much money. I've been acquainted with Jim for some months now, and if there's anybody involved in these sorts of projects that can make a dollar go a long ways, it's Jim. He can take a little bit of money and tell a well of a story. One of the stories that I want to see brought forward in the near future, and I've talked to Jim about this, is I don't think the situation for the Hammond family up there in Hardy Basin has been articulated as well as it should be. I became acquainted with Susie Hammond way back in the late 1980s. She and I had a lot in common. because I was running on Ruby Lake, livestock on Ruby Lake National Wildlife Refuge, and she and the Hammond family were running livestock on the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. At the same time, we were being confronted by the same adverse situations, and we both agreed that the agency people did not have good science to back up what they were advocating, and in fact, the actions were going to be detrimental. So Susie was, at that time, she was the main activist in Harney County. She was the one that was going out and uncovering the science and raising the awareness of the people, not only there in Southern Oregon, but elsewhere. And that was really the root cause of what accumulated more recently when the Hammonds were put into prison. Mm-hmm. It all came about because of retaliation. The agencies didn't like what she was doing. They had to counter that in the best way they could. And so they began taking actions in that community and with regards to the Hammonds ranching operation that culminated in forcing the Hammonds into a situation where they found themselves where they had to take certain actions to protect their property. That's really what the backfire was about. Mm-hmm. And so this is very important to me. I want that story told. I want to talk about that abuse by that agency. I want to talk about the retaliation and the persecution. Mm-hmm. And people understand that that is one of the most insidious and cruel things that's ever happened to anybody, any place. A kind of actions that you would think about, you read about in socialistic nations where they persecute their people. Well, this actually happened there in Harney County. And all Ammon Bundy was trying to do up there was trying to go out and help those people. And
let's not forget Lavoy Finicum. Let's not forget Lavoy Finicum.
And Lavoy Finicum.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that story needs to be told more clearly. And fortunately, I was up there and became personally acquainted with Dwight and Susie Hammond back there in the late 80s and early 90s. We used to go up and stay at their place, and Susie and Dwight would take me around the valley and introduce me to some of the older ranchers that had taken pictures, people that were trying to tell the story of how it was adversely affecting their action of the agencies, were adversely affecting wildlife. And so I'm privileged to have copies of those pictures. And I think if I get a chance to work with Jim, that we could tell a well of a story that will get that truth out. Yeah. And that's why we need all the support we can get from anybody that cares about the future of this nation. Because if we allow these kinds of lies and this kind of disinformation to continue, which is actually an attack on our very system of government, our constitutional form of government, it's going to eventually destroy America. So every American should be concerned, and I'm just glad I'd be able to talk a little bit about it and how concerned I am, and how important I think these kinds of projects are.
Well, and Cliff and Jim, both of you have alluded to the fact that some of the ranchers that gave testimony, you mentioned this, Jim, are passed away or are no longer in a position to be able to do that. The thing that we need to do is we need to realize this is a natural resource. Most of the people that are standing up right now are people with gray hair. And we've got to take advantage while the time is right, because young people that are following in our footsteps, a lot of them don't have a clue, and we've got to be able to provide a blueprint, a accurate history of all these things that have happened, so that when the young people finally wake up and they finally realize there's a serious problem here, we can help them with information that they can understand.
Absolutely. one thing that struck me this evening during our conversation, Jim was talking about going across the state of Nevada. We did for several days. We traveled across to the western part of the state, into the central part of the state, and then upon the conclusion of doing that, Jim went down to Las Vegas, and I and others put him in touch with sportsmen down there that are very concerned about all the adverse action of the agencies. But thinking back, even 10 or 15 years ago, if we'd had a guy like Jim around, my gosh, think of all the people we could have interviewed at that time. I was fortunate enough that I did get short 2, 3, 4, up to 10-page affidavits from a lot of these people that are now deceased. But my gosh, if Jim had been around a number of years ago, we could have spent a week going around and interviewing ranchers and miners and sportsmen and prospectors all over the state of Nevada. And those people were persecuted as well and put out of business.
Right.
And they did their best to fight, but like myself and many others, that wasn't our life ambition, to fight the government. All each of us wanted to do was to enjoy the great outdoors and enjoy our way of life. And we had to train ourselves, and we had to take away from our lives and our businesses and go out and try to do our best. And it's been basically a lose-lose situation. But we're not going to give up, because we're not going to give up on America, and this is what America is about.
And Cliff, your comment is right on. It's not natural to feel this way about our government, because we were raised as kids to believe in our government and to believe that they would do the right thing. And it's only been through experience over the last 20 or 30 years that we've started to realize how far we've gone in the wrong direction. Jim, I'm going to give you the last couple of minutes here. We're at the end of the program, but I want you to let our listeners know where they can go to support your film and where they can see the trailer on your film.
Well, thanks, Dan. Certainly. They can go to landgrabdocumentary.com. That's landgrabdocumentary.com. And as I said, I have someone that's helping me with that website. It's up very, very new, and it's just linked. The trailer, I believe, is on that website. If not, you can always go to my flagship YouTube channel, as long as they continue to keep it up, Northwest Liberty News on YouTube, and you can see that trailer and a lot of the other videos that I did with some of the ranchers down there. And I just want to say to people out there, as I was stating earlier, you really don't realize how much, how necessary farmers and ranchers are really to this nation and to the food production in this nation. And if you care about Americana and you care about how things used to be, and I guess in a sense you have a really a desire to get things back, to like the Old West. You really need to support. And it doesn't even have to be my film. Support ranchers, stand up for the people that are being persecuted. Without going too deep, we could do a whole other show on the Hammonds, but the Hammonds are spending 5 years in prison, and they really just basically a fire jumped over a backfire jumped over their property and burned a small amount of land that was, I think, theirs to really graze on anyway. If you look into that, it's just one terrible event after another, Dan, and these ranchers are just are being decimated. Hence the article today in the Wall Street Journal, the one that we talked about. They're losing the battle, man. The ranchers are losing the battle, and if they lose the battle, we all lose the battle.
Absolutely. If we lose private property in this country, we've lost our country, because in fact, that's the difference between us and a collectivist society. The difference between us and communism is that we are supposed to have the rights to private property. Well, gentlemen, thank you for being our guest tonight, and thank you for doing the program that you're doing, Jim, and I asked our listeners to please go to landgrabdocumentary.com and donate some money for this project. I know I'm going to, and I think people all over this country need to support this film because this is very important for the future of our country. Thank you again, gentlemen, and with that, I'll turn the show back over to you, Kelby, and thank our listeners for listening.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this week's show with Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. God bless. Good night. We'll see you next Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific.